We've noticed in recent days that President Trump has been growing impatient with Vladimir Putin over how long it's taken to reach a deal. And so is it something that surprises you, or is it something that was bound to happen?
I think that most people didn't take very seriously his campaign promise to end the war in a day. I mean, we knew that wasn't going to happen, and the essential problem is that Putin thinks he can gain more militarily than he can gain by negotiating. And he has kind of staked his political future on establishing at least some kind of hegemony over Kyiv. And the important thing is ensuring that it does not join what Moscow perceives as an anti-Russian alliance, NATO. Russia isn't even that thrilled about former Soviet states joining the European Union, but for them, the red line is NATO, and the conundrum is that it's impossible for Ukrainians to see how they could live in peace with their neighbor, at least as long as Putin is the leader of Russia, unless they have some kind of security guarantees to deter future aggression with from Russia, and that's why they wanted to join NATO. But if they couldn't join NATO, they would like to have some kind of
security guarantee,
legally binding deterrence of some way, of some sort. So that's why it's almost impossible to square the circle. As much as main demand is the West should keep out of Ukraine, because he wants to dominate it.
And I just wonder what you make of the fact that, of course, Western leaders, they would like to see de-escalation in this situation. Would you say Russia has benefited from that, from just the idea of we don't want to have an intense confrontation over this, that they've just kind of run out the clock?
Well, yeah, run out the clock is a good way to put it, because I think Putin is counting on Ukraine fatigue in the West, and we definitely have it here in the United States. Especially after I shouldn't say after the election, but over the last year and a half or so, kind of culminating in this new approach that the present administration has. I think that one thing that he hasn't really, assessed well is the staying power of Europe, and that's partially because of our president. Because they see that they are facing now a new reality, where the U.S. has said, Europe, if it's in Europe, it's your problem, it's not our problem. And so you see Europe taking Russia a lot more seriously. They can't necessarily depend on the U.S. to take charge and be their defender of the last resort. They're not even sure that the U.S. would come to their defense under Trump. Putin, I think, has calculated that, as you say, he can run out the clock. Eventually, that even Europe will get tired, and Ukraine will fall into his hands like a ripe fruit or something.
And you even mentioned that Putin views the NATO alliance as something that's hostile toward Russia. Yeah. But we've seen following the invasion that countries that were formerly neutral and non-aligned, such as Finland and Sweden, have joined.
Exactly.
Does that actually run the risk of escalating tensions?
Having Finland and Sweden join?
Yeah.
No, I don't think so. It's been really interesting to me how restrained the reaction of the Kremlin was to the news that they've now got this, now had their border with NATO has more than doubled, with the long border with Finland, which I think really, sort of gives lie to this argument that the main concern of Russia is Ukraine joining NATO. If that were the case, then they would be massing troops on the border of Finland too, before they joined, and it didn't happen. Yeah, I mean, I am of the school that in order to really stop Putin, you have to have a credible threat of costs. I mean, he doesn't think our threats or Trump's threats are credible. But I mean, NATO is obviously, he's obviously afraid of NATO. I mean, he has gone after the countries that are not under the NATO umbrella. So he's gone after Ukraine, he's gone after Georgia, he's gone after Moldova. So, I mean, all those countries have some kind of occupation by Russian forces. There's no occupation of the Baltic states, the three, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, because they're under the protection of NATO. He doesn't bother them.
And that was the thing I was wondering about in terms of your experiences as U.S. ambassador to Georgia, because I'm sure you certainly had experiences in having to deal with Russian issues. And one thing in particular is you see how the Kremlin kind of has a hold on those smaller countries that aren't protected by NATO. What would you say are some examples of the way Russia exerts soft power, or in some cases hard power, over those countries that are sharing its border?
Yeah. So as I said, all three. So there are three former states, there's three former Soviet states that are in NATO, and then there are three who are not in NATO but have aspirations to join NATO in the case of Ukraine and Georgia, and just the EU in the case of Moldova. So all three of them have, against their will, Russian forces occupying a portion of their territory. For Ukraine and Georgia, it's about 20%. For Moldova, it's not well known, but there's a sliver of Moldova that has had Russian peacekeeping forces since like 1992 or 3. Moldova has wanted Chisinau, the capital, the government has said, we want those forces out. We don't need Russian forces to keep the peace. But Russia hasn't withdrawn. Georgia said the same thing. This is sovereign Georgian territory. We don't need Russian forces. So, I mean, that is, I think, the kind of the ultimate the ultimate way that Russia gets in the heads of policymakers in those three countries. And each country has kind of reacted differently. Georgia has done a kind of a 180-degree turn from being all in for joining NATO and the EU to being standoffish, even hostile to Washington and Brussels, and accommodating or appeasing Russia. So that's kind of the main way that they affect policy. In Georgia, that if the Russians wanted, they could be in Tbilisi in about 45 minutes. That's how close their forces are in South Ossetia. But other ways that they do it. I mean, there's they use both carrots and sticks. One of the classic carrots they use is natural gas, and that worked for a long time with Ukraine. But with recent leaders, they've seen that there's a real cost in accepting deals from Russia.
There's an expectation of something in return.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and it usually has to do with their foreign policy. I remember when I was in Georgia, So when I was there, we still had a robust program of military cooperation, training and equipping the Georgian Armed Forces, to become, as the Pentagon put it, become like hedgehogs, be not very attractive to consume and digest. So we were helping them, be able to uh, deter Russian tanks, basically. And whenever we had any kind of exercise, um, there would be either some scorching statement, from Moscow, or there would be some kind of kinetic exercise in South Ossetia or Abkhazia. And I remember I went up to what we call the administrative border line. When we saw both sides of this line as sovereign Georgian territory, but one side was occupied. And there was one time I heard explosions in the distance. And I said to this Georgian official, what's going on? He said, oh, well, that's because you guys came over and had an exercise with our armed forces. So they're showing their displeasure by having exercises with missiles and artillery and things like that. So a lot of it is just kind of getting in the heads of their neighbors to ensure they stay in the orbit of Russia. And if they don't, you have things like what's happening in Ukraine now, or what happened in Georgia in 2008.
That dynamic is fascinating because that's a very in-your-face example of how you
would. Yeah, it's not subtle.
Yeah, yeah, right. And I mean, there were also these examples we see where it's just words that alone can be very influential. And I kind of want to bring up this example from Tuesday because President Trump had said if it weren't for him, really bad things would have already happened to Russia. That was something he said in a social media post, but Russia Security Council deputy chairman responded to that. And he said, quote, I only know of one really bad thing, World War III. There's just a lot to break down there.
There's a great example, Jaden.
Yeah.
That's a great example of getting into our heads.
Yeah.
It's, that threat of World War III and the implication that it would be nuclear has been very effective in our decision making and in Europe's decision making, not wanting to escalate to the point where it starts World War III.
Right.
So we have put, real limits on what we provide Ukraine in terms of, especially in terms of range of weapons. It was effective with the Biden administration, and it was effective with Germany.
Yeah, and we just saw recently that Germany has lifted their limit.
Yes, so there's a new chancellor. Yeah, I mean they have this very effective cruise missile called the Taurus, which has a pretty long range. And then his predecessor, Schultz, right? Just we're not going to provide that because they were afraid of escalation. And Merz said, we're going to provide it, and we're going to be putting no limitations. So, I mean, that is a great example of, getting into our heads.
You think for those of us who were around for the Cold War era, I wasn't, but of course it was always implanted in people's heads of nuclear weapons and atomic bombs. And those types of things are still effective because you hear Americans say, I don't want another war. I already lived through that. And we're seeing once again, would you say that we're kind of heading towards that arms race or at least Cold War era feeling?
Yes and no. I mean, with the Cold War, there was a kind of a grand global competition of ideology. And there were a number of, what we used to call proxy wars,
right,
in Central America, in Africa, Vietnam. And you don't have, those flashpoints, and you don't have this clash of ideologies anymore. So that's not to say that the world is safer. I mean, I would argue that it's just as unsafe, but unsafe because of miscalculations more than anything else, not of like not of like the Korean War, the Vietnam War, where you would have a big proxy war where each side was harming the other side. I mean, Ukraine obviously is partially that, um, but I am really concerned. I think that the world is less safe because I am a creation of the Cold War, and I served in the State Department for at least 5 years or 7 years, I guess it was, when the Soviet Union was the enemy. But the big difference was we had a robust engagement with the Soviet military, with various arms control talks, both conventional arms and strategic arms. And the thing that really I think concerns me is that there are no talks now. I'm not in favor of broad talks with broad political talks with the Kremlin, because I think it's a regime which is carrying out war crimes in Ukraine, and also has been very hostile towards us. But we don't have this dialogue anymore, military to military, and that concerns me. That I remember, so I was at the OSCE where you have the conventional arms agreements, and I asked this military officer, what's the most valuable part of these arms control agreements, and he said the bilateral visits, where you actually go to arms depots and you meet people, and then you have the regular talks where you're across the table with your counterparts. He said, I feel if there was a real, he said, if there was a crisis, I know who to call.
We saw that during the Cuban Missile Crisis, where Kennedy
Yeah.
had to make that phone call, because that could have been ended very badly had that
Yes.
not been made.
Right. Well, yeah, thank God they had that hotline. It was just put in, maybe a year or two before. They didn't have that hotline. Yeah, there probably would have been some kind of clash.
Obviously, times are different and we're definitely more mobile, but that doesn't exactly mean that country to country that communication exists. So that's an interesting point you bring up. I do wonder, though, given that we just saw Germany lift its restrictions on how far its weapons that it provides to Ukraine can go, how will Europe respond differently now? Because even President Trump here in the US has said he may have to deal with Putin differently. What does a different response look like?
There's a couple parts to that. One part is, will the US replenish Ukraine? I mean, will the president agree to do more arms transfers to Ukraine? It is not apparent to me that they're going to start running out of the ammunition that we gave them. The SAM surface air missiles and the Patriot system. You need to replenish those missiles. So that's part of it. The other part of this is pressure. And the president rightfully has taken a lot of heat that he tends to pressure Ukraine more than he pressures Russia. And so the U.S. Senate has really stepped up. 82 senators have co-sponsored a bill putting what are known as secondary sanctions on Russia, because what is financing this horrible war are oil and gas sales, primarily to China and India, but other places. I think Brazil too buys Russian oil. Biden didn't want to do it because you take that oil off the market and gas prices go up. But the Senate, is uh, sending a signal to the White House too. Enough playing footsie with Putin here. I mean, he only knows the language of power, and if you hit him in his pocketbook, he will be much more amenable to negotiations.
They still have connections and other allies that they can rely
They
on.
do, and they're big economies. China and India have a huge thirst for oil and gas, and they're getting a great deal. They're getting these discounted prices from Russia. It's time, it's time to call them out.
Given that Putin's language is more direct, more confrontational, provocative, what do you think is going to be the change that we see as a result of these negotiations happening? Because I don't see Putin as someone that's willing to make a lot of concessions in these negotiations.
I mean, it is hard for me to see how Ukraine could sign on to these very maximalist demands by Russia. Basically, Russia wants control of their foreign policy. They don't want them to join NATO. They want a regime change in Kyiv. They don't want to work with Zelensky, and they want to have their own person in power. I can't see Ukraine agreeing to that. I mean, they have seen what happens to Ukrainian towns and Ukrainian people who are under occupation, and the majority of Ukrainians, although they are exhausted by the war, they also do not want to see Ukraine under any kind of Russian influence, let alone occupation, because they know what it means. Just as the people in South Ossetia and Abkhazia know what it means. It means the loss of civil liberties. It means loss of ties with the West, and it means kind of a stagnant economy. So there are a lot of people, including up on Capitol Hill, who think that the way to do this is to choke off the money to the Putin war machine. It's not guaranteed of success because it's Putin is in charge of public opinion there. He can shape public opinion. It's also dangerous. It's dangerous in the sense that if there are no kind of valves on the pressure cooker there because of the repression, you could end up with a case of like what happened in 1917 in Russia, where it was just it's a revolution and it led to civil war. And I mean, who wants to see anarchy and civil war in a country that has thousands of nuclear missiles?
Yeah, I don't think many people do.
Yeah, and that's the Biden administration, I think, did take a lot of heat for the limits they put on Ukrainian armed forces. I mean, I understand their point of view. It's not a very ethical point of view. Basically telling Ukraine, we're not going to let you win, but go keep ahead and go on dying, for us, against this Russian war machine. So, I mean, there are no good choices here, unfortunately. But I don't see Putin ending the war anyway, but militarily. And that's why we have to continue to support Ukraine.
Yeah, as you mentioned, public opinion certainly plays a role in that. And Putin, as we've seen, according to the numbers that are at least the most accurate that we can get, he still has a lot of public support and certainly is able to shape the narrative surrounding this war, especially when you have a lot of oppositional media that doesn't exist. Just looking at the U.S. response to this, when you can't defeat the narrative and the support that you're providing also sometimes seems insufficient, What is the other option?
Another problem is we have through in the last couple of months we have unilaterally disarmed and and trying to fight them on this media front by basically dismantling the Voice of America and the Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. We have frozen all support for independent media, which is based in. I mean, everybody, unless they're willing to go to prison or go fight on the front, if you want to have an independent voice, you have to leave the country. And so there's offshore media, which is quite good, but they depend on support from the EU and the US, and we are cutting their funding. So, yeah, I mean, unless Congress restores that funding, it's going to be difficult for us to fight that battle. And from my, read on the Russian media, there is a completely alternative media narrative there. And I do believe that these polls are accurate when they, I mean, they're not completely accurate because nobody wants to tell a stranger, oh, I don't support this war.
Especially if that stranger is knowing someone who's close to Vladimir Putin, I'm sure.
Yeah, right. Yeah. It might even be calling from the FSB but that's all they see. I mean, I think in Moscow and St. Petersburg, they have a more nuanced view of it, and they have access to through VPNs. They can access Western media. But if you look at the television and other mass media, it's there's a very patriotic feel. That we have to defeat. Once again, we have to defeat Nazism. They claim that Zelensky is a Nazi. Strange for a Jewish person to be a Nazi, but
yeah, the math doesn't work out there.
No, it doesn't. But they're able to get some traction with that, using that trope.
Well, Ambassador Kelly, as always, it's a fascinating world we live in. I mean, the conversations are complex, but what a world.